There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a man's hands when the world stops needing them. Not the silence of rest. Not the silence of a Sunday morning or a fishing line going still on a quiet lake. This is a different kind, heavier with edges on it. The silence of a skill the world has quietly decided it no longer requires. The silence of a telephone that used to ring every week and now goes days without making a sound. And the man who owns the telephone has stopped pretending he doesn't notice. Earl Bowen knew that silence the way he knew the smell of flux and hot steel. He had been living inside it for the better part of a decade, and he had made his accommodation with it. And he did not speak about it to anyone because speaking about it would have required admitting that it mattered more than he wanted it to. He was 72 years old on the morning of October the 6th, 1984. And he was already in his shop before the sun had fully cleared the tree line east of Millhaven, Ohio. The fluorescent light above his workbench hummed its single tuneless note. The concrete floor was cold through the soles of his boots. The shop smelled the way it had always smelled: machine oil and metal dust and the faint ghost of 1,000 burned beads laid over 50 years of mornings, exactly like this one. And Earl stood at his bench doing what he had done nearly every morning since he was 15 years old. He was reading a piece of steel. Not reading it the way a man reads a newspaper, skimming for headlines and moving on. Reading it the way his teacher Harold Finch had taught him to read it back in 1927, when Earl was 15 years old and new to the trade. And Harold was a broad-shouldered man in a leather apron who had a way of making time feel like it was on his side. Harold had handed Earl a scrap of welded plate one morning without explanation and told him to look at it. Just look. Earl had looked. He had seen a weld. 2 pieces of steel joined together. He said as much. Harold said nothing. He just waited with the particular patience of a man who has made peace with the fact that understanding takes as long as it takes and rushing it produces nothing useful. Earl looked again. Longer this time. He started to see other things. The bead was uneven at the start, smoothing out through the middle, then tightening near the end. The arc had wandered slightly in one place, just a fraction before correcting itself. The color of the oxidation along the edges told him something about the heat that had been applied and the speed at which the torch had traveled. He told Harold what he saw. Harold nodded. Just once. Then he said it, the thing he said perhaps once a week in various forms, the thing that Earl would carry for 57 years like a tool. He never set down a weld is a man's handwriting in steel. If you look close enough at how it was run, you can tell whether he was calm or scared, skilled, or guessing, taking his time, or nearly out of it. Any fool can lay a bead. A tradesman reads one. Harold's leather apron still hung on a nail beside the shop door. Earl had put it there after Harold passed in the spring of 1983 and had not moved it since. It was dark with age and stiff along the bottom hem, and there was a small burn hole near the left pocket from a slag pop in 1951 that Harold had gotten while working a difficult joint on a repair job nobody else in the county would take on. The apron had outlasted the man who wore it by 1.5 years. Earl was not sentimental about objects in general, but he had decided without quite making the decision consciously that the apron belonged on that nail, and there it stayed. Outside, Millhaven was waking up the way it had been waking up for years, slowly, and with less energy than it used to have, like a man getting out of bed on a cold morning when he has nowhere particular to be. The town sat in the flat land, between 2 sets of low hills in western Ohio, the kind of town that had been built around manufacturing and had never fully figured out what to do with itself when the manufacturing began to leave. The grain elevator on the south end still ran. The feed store still ran. There was a diner on Main Street that had changed hands twice but kept the same counter stools and the same pie case and most of the same regulars who had been sitting on those stools since the Eisenhower administration. But the machine shop on the Depot Road had closed in 1978. The stamping plant out on Route 9 had gone quiet in 1981. 3 other small manufacturing operations had consolidated or relocated in the years between leaving buildings that stood empty along the county road with for sale signs that nobody was seriously reading. The hardware store still sold fasteners and pipe fittings, but half the shelf space now held goods shipped in from somewhere else, assembled by hands that had never touched Ohio clay, packaged in plastic that suggested precision while delivering something considerably less than it. You could buy a wrench at the hardware store in Mill Haven in 1984 that looked like a wrench and weighed like a wrench. And the first time you put real torque on it, the head would round off and you would understand the difference between a thing that is made and a thing that is manufactured. Earl understood the difference. He had understood it for 50 years. And the world, as far as he could tell, was becoming less interested in the distinction every year. The men who had built things in Mill Haven were getting old. The ones who had not gotten old had moved away to Columbus, to Cleveland, to places where the work still existed in some form. And the town had stopped calling the ones who remained not through malice, but through the quiet momentum of a world that had decided there was an easier way to do things, even if the easier way produced results that did not last. Earl had noticed this, the way you notice weather not all at once, but gradually, in the accumulation of small signs over many seasons. The jobs that used to come to him had thinned out over the years. A cracked machine frame to weld, a pump shaft to true up, a casting that needed a repair nobody else in the county could manage, not because the repair was beyond current technology, but because current technology had decided that repair was less cost-effective than replacement, and cost-effectiveness had become somewhere along the line the only measure that counted. He had not complained about this. He was not a man who complained, but he had felt the change in the silence of the telephone and the stillness of the shop door. And he had gone on opening the shop at 6 in the morning out of a stubbornness that was not quite pride and not quite habit, but something that sat between the two and refused to move. This particular Saturday there was an estate auction at 10 o'clock on the north end of Mill Road at the property of the late August Crane, Gus Crane, as everyone in Mill Haven had called him for as long as anyone could remember. Earl had heard about it from Fergus Cable, who ran the small engine repair shop on the east side of town, and had known Earl since they were in the same school building together, which was long enough ago that neither of them thought about it in years anymore. Fergus had mentioned the auction on Thursday when Earl stopped in to return a borrowed socket set. Said it might be worth going to. Gus Crane had run the best machine shop in the county for 51 years. A man like that accumulates tools the way good tradesmen do, carefully and with purpose, and with the understanding that the right tool properly maintained will outlast its owner by decades if you treat it with the respect it deserves. Earl had not been to an estate sale in 3 years. He did not need tools. His shop was equipped. But he had thought about Gus Crane on the short drive out Mill Road the way you think about a man you respected from a careful distance. He had known Gus the way one tradesman knows another in a town of that size, by reputation first, then by long acquaintance without intimacy. They had crossed paths at the hardware store for 40 years, had nodded to each other in the particular way of men who understand a shared language and do not need to discuss it. Men who know the weight of a good tool and the difference between a repair done right and a repair done quickly, and who have never confused the two and who recognize that quality in each other without needing to put it into words. Gus Crane had been a lean, upright man with a machinist's precision about everything he did, including the way he moved through a room and the way he chose his words when words were required. He had opened his shop on Mill Road in 1933 and had run it without interruption for 51 years until his hands had begun to betray him in his late 70s, and even then he had stayed on adapting to what was possible, doing what he could, which was still more than most. Gus had died in January of 1984. 79 years old, alone in the rooms above his shop on a January night, when the temperature had dropped to single digits and the old building had creaked and settled the way old buildings do in serious cold. The town had said the right things about him and called it the end of an era, and then moved on to other things, because that is what towns do. And the burying of what an era meant and what it cost to lose it is not something that gets acknowledged in the speeches people make at funerals. Earl pulled his half-ton pickup into the gravel lot beside the Crane property at 9:15. The morning was cold and bright, the sky the hard, flat blue of Ohio in October, the kind of sky that makes shadows crisp and distances feel closer than they are. There were already 30 or 40 people there. Dealers and neighbors and the professionally curious milling among the rows of equipment and household goods set out on the grass and gravel in the methodical arrangement of a properly run estate auction. Earl put his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and walked the rows. There was a good equipment, a lathe that had been maintained the right way, which is to say it showed the honest wear of a machine that had been used hard and cared for harder rather than the false cleanliness of a machine that has been wiped down for sale without having been properly attended to in years. A surface grinder with a chuck that still showed true when Earl checked it with the small indicator he carried in his jacket pocket out of lifelong habit. Hand tools racked on a board in order of size, which is how a real machinist stores his tools. Not because someone instructed him to, but because a man who respects his work respects the instruments of it, and putting a tool away in its proper place is the first step in being able to trust it the next time you need it. Earl looked at these things with the slow attention of someone who understood their cost and their history, and he felt a particular quality of respect for the man who had owned them and used them and maintained them, and would now have them dispersed among people who might or might not understand what they had. He was near the back of the lot, past the main rows of equipment, when he saw the box. It had been set apart from everything else. Not in a row. Not with the other lots, but off to one side near the property fence in a patch of shadow that the October sun had not yet reached. It sat on two short lengths of timber that kept it off the ground, a practice that someone who understood steel would recognize as the proper way to store a metal container outdoors, keeping the bottom clear of moisture contact. The steel itself was scaled over with the deep orange crust of serious surface rust. The kind that comes from years of outdoor exposure, not neglect exactly, but the gradual work of weather on unprotected iron. The seam where the lid met the body of the box was obscured by what appeared from a distance to be more of the same rust. The handwritten price tag wired to the front handle read $5. There was no one near it. Earl walked to it. He crouched down, which cost him something in his knees on a cold morning. He put his reading glasses on his nose, though he was not reading anything yet. He looked at the seam, then he took his right glove off and ran his thumb along it. What he felt stopped him completely. He did not move for a long moment. He repositioned his thumb and ran it along the seam again, more slowly this time, from the near corner to the far end and back again. He pressed more firmly on the return pass, his thumb finding the texture beneath the rust crust the way a practiced hand finds what it is looking for in the dark by knowledge of what the thing is supposed to feel like and the patience to let that knowledge do its work. That seam had not rusted shut. He had seen rust bridge a gap before. It was not uncommon on old equipment that had been stored outdoors, where the oxidation products built up in joints and crevices and created the appearance of a solid connection where none existed. A firm pull would break that kind of false seal. More importantly, that kind of rust had a particular texture under the thumb, granular, slightly soft, uneven, in the way that a natural process is always uneven. What he felt under his thumb was not that. What he felt was a bead. A welding bead run along the seam from the outside, flowing the lid to the body of the box in a closed loop all the way around, lid to body, lid to body. The bead, continuous and deliberate, a sealed ring with no gaps and no visible interruptions. Earl could feel the crown of the bead under the rust crust, the slight ridge of deposited metal that the arc process always left the evidence of heat and wire, and the controlled movement of a hand holding a torch. Someone had welded that lid to that box on purpose. He moved his thumb along the seam a third time, pressing firmly, building the picture. He found two places, one near the near corner, and one about 2/3 of the way along the far side where the bead had a slight irregularity. A fractional hesitation. A place where the arc had wavered before steadying again. Not a large deviation. Not the kind of error a casual observer would notice. But Earl Bowen was not a casual observer, and under his thumb the irregularities read as clearly as words on a page. He had seen that kind of hesitation before. He had felt it in his own hands on certain cold mornings in recent years when the joints announced themselves and the body offered a reminder that it was not what it had been at 35. The hesitation of hands that had once been fully reliable and were still, through long practice and sheer will, capable of careful work, but not easily. Not without effort, not without bracing the elbows in and slowing down and refusing to hurry, because at a certain point in a man's life, refusing to hurry is the only way to get something done right. Gus Crane's hands had started shaking around 1978. Earl knew this from Fergus Cable, who had mentioned it in passing a couple of years back in the way that Millhaven people mentioned such things as information rather than gossip, the practical knowledge of a community keeping track of its own. Earl stayed crouched at that box for 11 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch twice. He ran his thumb along the seam twice more. He looked at the surface of the rust, where the crust had thinned in places worn by the years and the weather. And in those thinned places, he could see faintly but unmistakably to a man who knew what he was seeing, the ghost of the bead itself running under the rust in its steady, deliberate ring. This was not the work of a man sealing something against weather. You do not weld a box shut against weather. You weld a box shut against people, against the wrong hands and the wrong eyes, against the men who would look at a dead machinist's toolbox and see only scrap steel worth $4 at the bin. You weld it shut when what is inside needs to stay inside, accessible only to the one person among all the people in the world who will know to look for the weld and know what the weld is saying and have the equipment and the patience to answer it properly. Earl stood up. His knees registered their objection. He went and found the auctioneer. The opening bid was $5. Earl said $60. The heads along the fence turned. The reaction moved through the assembled crowd, the way reactions move in small towns, not all at once, but in a wave, one person nudging another, a murmur, building attention, redirecting from the other lots to the old man in the canvas jacket who had just offered 12 times the asking price for a rusted box no one could open. Cledge Pratt had been standing near the fence. Cledge was 48 years old and ran Pratt Salvage and Recovery, which his father Harwick had built into the largest scrap operation in 3 counties, and which Cledge had expanded further through the blunt application of volume and competitive pricing and the willingness to buy things by the pound without asking what they had been before they became scrap. He was a heavy man, thick through the neck and chest, with a clean-shaved face that reddened easily in cold weather, and thinning hair kept short under a company cap. He wore a polo shirt with the Pratt Salvage logo stretched across the chest and drove a late-model flatbed with the same logo on the door. And he had spent his morning buying steel and cast iron by the hundredweight and not once wondering what any of it had been before it came to him. He had looked at the welded box earlier. Earl had noticed him look at it, the quick glance of a man categorizing and dismissing a rough calculation of weight versus hassle running behind his eyes for a second before he moved on to the lathe. When Earl said $60, Cledge looked up from the conversation he was having near the fence and processed what he had heard. Then a slow grin spread across his face, the particular grin of a man who has been handed a very easy opportunity. $60, Cledge said. His voice was loud enough to carry deliberately. He looked at the men along the fence, making sure of his audience. $60 for a box you can't even crack open. He paused, timing it the way a man who is comfortable with crowds knows to time things. He let his eyes travel to Earl and then back to the men along the fence. Boys, I believe the Tin Man just bought himself a tin box. The laughter came because a loud man with social standing had given permission for it, and it was easier to laugh than not to. Several of the dealers chuckled. A couple of the men who had been standing near Cledge grinned and looked at Earl and then looked away. The auctioneer brought the gavel down with professional neutrality and said "sold" to the gentleman in the canvas jacket and wrote out a receipt. Earl did not look at Cledge Pratt. He did not look at the men along the fence. He said nothing at all. He took the receipt from the auctioneer and put it in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and went to find 2 young men who could help him get 160 pounds of rusted steel onto the bed of his pickup. It took 3 of them and a hand truck and some creative maneuvering around the tailgate. The springs sat down hard when the box settled on the bed. Earl ratcheted 2 tie-down straps over the box, checked each one with a thumb, hooked under the webbing, checked them again, and drove out of the lot at 35 miles an hour. There is a kind of patience that looks like foolishness from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a man paying too much for the wrong thing. What the outside cannot see is that the patient man and the laughing crowd are looking at entirely different things, and the patient man has spent 50 years learning to look at things the laughing crowd does not know to look for. Earl drove the 9 miles back into Millhaven with the box riding steady in the bed and the straps holding and nothing in particular hurrying him. By Monday morning, the story had made its way through the diner and the feed store and the small engine shop and the gas station at the edge of town in the efficient way that stories travel in towns of that size without anyone quite meaning to carry them. Arriving everywhere simultaneously built up slightly larger each time it passed through another set of hands. The Tin Man had spent $60 on a rusted box that couldn't be opened. Cledge Pratt had told it at the diner counter over eggs on Sunday morning and given it the full treatment, adding detail and adjusting the pauses and allowing the name, the Tin Man, to be repeated enough times that it stuck. Fergus Cable came by the shop on Monday afternoon. He stood in the doorway and looked at the box sitting on the concrete floor near the back wall, and he was quiet for a moment in the manner of a man who is working up to saying what he came to say. "Earl," he finally said, "you paid $60 for a thing that won't open. I know you've been working steel longer than most men in this county have been alive, and I know you know your business better than I do, but I'm asking you plain, what were you thinking Earl was filing a burr off a clamp at his bench?" He did not look up. "It'll open," he said. Fergus waited to see if there was more. There was not. He looked at the box and then at Earl, and then put his cap back on and went back to his own shop, because 40 years of friendship had taught him that Earl Bowen said what he meant and meant what he said, and did not elaborate on either unless elaboration was necessary. For 3 evenings Earl did nothing to the box but examine it. On the first evening he brought it to his main workbench and spent 2 hours with a wire brush removing loose rust from the seam section by section until the weld bead showed clean beneath. He worked slowly, brushing and looking and running his thumb along each revealed section, building up a detailed picture of the full weld, the way a man assembles a machine from its individual components, methodically in sequence, not moving to the next part until the current one is fully understood. What he found confirmed what the auction lot had suggested and added to it. The bead was single pass, one continuous run all the way around lid to body, without stopping except for those 2 places he had already found where the hands had faltered and steadied. The penetration was consistent throughout, which meant the travel speed had been controlled. The torch had moved at a pace the operator could sustain not faster than the work required, and that pace had been held remarkably steady for a man whose hands were no longer fully reliable. The crown of the bead was uniform. The tack points, the small preliminary spots of weld placed to hold the lid in alignment before the full bead was run, were neatly and precisely placed. 4 of them spaced with obvious thought about where they would do the most good. This was prepared work, the work of a man who had thought through the job before beginning it, who had set the lid carefully and checked it was true and then placed his tacks and looked at them and been satisfied before he struck the first arc for the full seal, who had then run that seal at the pace his hands could manage, braced against himself, refusing to hurry, carrying the torch around the full perimeter of the box without stopping, because stopping and restarting is where a shaking hand makes visible mistakes, and this man had not wanted visible mistakes. On the second evening, Earl sat on his shop stool for an hour and simply thought. He thought about what it meant for a machinist of 50 years, a man whose whole professional identity was built on precision, on the relationship between his hands, and the work they did to pick up a welding torch when those hands were no longer what they had been. To decide that this one thing, this particular task, was important enough to use whatever remained of the fine motor control that 50 years of practice had built to brace the elbows in and slow the breathing and run the seal that needed to be run. A man makes that decision when what is inside the box is worth the last careful hour of work he has available to him, not worth a careful hour, worth the last one. On the third evening he laid out the cutting equipment. He did this deliberately and in order, the way Harold Finch had shown him in 1927, and the way he had done it 10,000 times since cutting torch and regulators. Oxygen and acetylene tanks checked and valved correctly. A bucket of water positioned within arm's reach on the left side, the fire blanket folded on the near edge of the bench where he could reach it without looking. He chalked a line on the box lid a finger's width inside the weld bead, precisely inside, so the cut would take the bead without touching the body or the lid proper, leaving both pieces clean and intact. He put on his welding jacket. He pulled the gloves on. He checked the regulator pressures. He pushed the dark lens down over his face. He lit the cutting torch at 8 o'clock in the evening. The shop filled with the small, steady roar of the flame, a sound Earl had lived inside for so long it registered less as noise than as the particular quality of silence that a working shop produces, the ambient sound of purposeful work that makes the surrounding quiet feel different from ordinary quiet. The first orange sparks jumped from the chalk line and scattered across the bench and the concrete floor, bright small arcs catching the shop light for a moment before going dark. Earl moved the flame along the line. He moved it at the pace the work wanted. No faster feeling. The metal responded to the heat, the resistance of the steel giving way to the cut in the measured way that good steel cuts when it is being cut correctly. His knees ached from standing. His eyes behind the dark glass were not the eyes of a 30-year-old man, but his hands, when there was a torch in them, remained what they had always been. They did not drift. They did not hurry. They held the pace the work required and maintained it through both long sides and then the two short ends, and then he came back to the starting point and the final quarter-inch of the cut, connected to the first and the weld that Gus Crane had run on some dark night in the autumn of 1981. The last clean seal in him, Earl now understood with complete certainty, came free from the box as a single piece. The lid sat loose in the body. Earl shut off the gas. He pushed the helmet back. He set the torch down and pulled his gloves off and placed them beside the torch. He did not reach for the lid. He stood at his bench and let the steel cool, because a careful man does not reach into freshly cut metal, regardless of what is waiting inside, and Earl Bowen had been a careful man for 57 years and saw no reason to change the practice now. He looked at Harold Finch's leather apron on the nail beside the door while he waited. He had tried to explain over the years what he had gotten from Harold Finch, and he had never managed it adequately. The skill was part of it, 57 years of applied knowledge that had begun with Harold's patient, unhurried teaching in a shop not very different from this one. But the skill was the smaller part. The larger part was harder to name. It had something to do with the relationship between a man and the work he had committed to. The idea that beginning a thing created an obligation, not a social obligation, not the kind of obligation that required other people to witness or validate it, but a private obligation between the man and the work itself. A thing begun was owed the courtesy of being finished. The quality of the finish was the measure of the man. Harold had never stated this as a principle. He had simply worked that way every day for as long as Earl had known him. And it had gotten into Earl through proximity and repetition and the long accumulation of watching a man be exactly what he claimed to be, until the way Harold worked became part of the way Earl worked, as natural and unexamined as breathing. The steel had cooled enough. Earl gripped the lid of the box with both bare hands and lifted it away. The air that came out was dry and cold, and carried the smell of old oilcloth and iron. The smell of something that had been sealed away from weather and time for years, preserved in the dark the way a thing is preserved when someone has taken serious care to keep it intact. Inside the box, where the rust had never reached the steel walls, were clean and dark. There were 3 things. Earl took them out one at a time and laid them on the bench under the work light. He did this without rushing, with the same methodical attention he had given every step of this process, because what was in front of him had been placed there with care and deserved to be received with equivalent care. He looked at the 3 things on his bench for a long moment, taking in what he could see before he touched anything further. Then he pulled his stool close and sat down under the light, and he began to read. Outside Millhaven was quiet. The shop clock read a few minutes before 10. Somewhere past the dark window, the leading edge of a weather front was moving in from the northwest, dropping the temperature toward the first frost of the season. The fluorescent light hummed its steady note above Earl's bench, the same note it had hummed for 20 years in this shop, unchanged by whatever was happening beneath it. And in the pool of light, it threw a 72-year-old man in a canvas jacket sat at his workbench and began to read what a dead man had trusted to steal. He would not leave that bench until nearly 4 in the morning. And what he found there in the oilcloth and the paper and the careful block print of a dying machinist's last deliberate work would change more than one story in Millhaven, Ohio, including, though he did not yet fully understand this, his own. The first thing Earl Bowen took from the box was wrapped in oilcloth. The heavy kind, waxed canvas, the kind that men of Gus Crane's generation used to wrap things they intended to keep. It had been folded with precision, the edges tucked under and pressed flat. And it held its shape when Earl lifted it from the box, the way a well-made thing holds its shape regardless of how long it has been waiting. He set it on the bench and unfolded it with care. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a single typed page produced on a machine with a fresh ribbon, every letter clean and dark. At the top, in plain block letters, Partnership Agreement, Crane Machine Works. Below that, a date spring of 1962. 2 names, August R. Crane and Harwick G. Pratt. The agreement itself was 7 short paragraphs in plain language, the language of men who did not see a need for ornamentation in legal matters and trusted that plain words said plainly were harder to misread than complicated words said elaborately. It stated that Harwick Pratt had contributed capital in exchange for a 1/2 interest in the business known as Crane Machine Works on Mill Road in Millhaven, Ohio, and that this interest extended to no more and no less than 50% of the enterprise for as long as the shop should continue to operate. 2 signatures at the bottom. Gus Crane's, firm and upright, the signature of a man in his mid-50s at the height of his working life and his confidence. Harwick Pratt's, a looser hand, the signature of a man more accustomed to a telephone than a pen. Earl read it twice. He set it aside. The second piece of paper was handwritten, dated the 14th of March, 1981. Written in the careful, slightly enlarged print of a man whose hands had lost the fine motor control required for cursive, but who had not allowed that loss to prevent him from saying what needed to be said. The letters were formed with the same deliberateness a machinist brings to a critical measurement, no flourish, no wasted motion. Each character occupying exactly the space it needed to occupy. It was a witnessed statement. Gus Crane's statement declared in plain and specific language that he had signed 1 partnership agreement in his lifetime regarding Crane Machine Works, that the document from 1962 represented the complete and final terms of any business arrangement he had ever entered into with Harwick Pratt, that he had signed no subsequent agreement altering those terms in any way, that any document purporting to transfer a greater interest in Crane Machine Works to Harwick Pratt or any member of his family was not a document he had willingly signed, and that his signature on any such document would have been obtained through the exploitation of the deterioration in his handwriting that had come with age and illness, which had made his signature easier to approximate and more difficult to distinguish from a guided imitation than it had once been. He stated that he was of clear and sound mind on the date of writing. He stated that he understood what he was attesting to and why. He stated that he had chosen to set this down in writing and have it witnessed because he did not trust what would happen to the truth after he was gone if the truth existed only in his own memory, which would go with him. Below Gus's statement and his signature was a second signature. Harold Finch, dated the same day, March 14th, 1981. In Harold's own handwriting, the deliberate upright print that Earl recognized from 100 notes left on workbench surfaces and job orders, over 30 years of knowing the man, a single sentence, I witness the above statement as freely and clearly given, and I attest to August Crane's full clarity of mind and intent on this date. Earl sat very still. He was not a demonstrative man. The men who knew him would have said that Earl Bowen's face in a moment of surprise was not very different from his face in a moment of calm. A slight settling of the features, a stillness around the eyes, a quality of interior attention that did not announce itself. But the shop was empty and no one was watching, and for a long moment Earl sat on his stool with the witness statement in his hands and absorbed what it was telling him. Harold Finch had been in this box. Harold, who had died in the spring of 1983. Harold, at whose funeral Earl had stood in the back of the church and looked at the plain casket and thought about the leather apron on the nail and the way Harold could look at a weld for 30 seconds and tell you things about it that most men couldn't tell you in 30 minutes. Harold, who had been 81 years old when he died and had kept his clarity and his judgment right up to the end. Harold had, in March of 1981, 2 years before he passed, gone to wherever Gus Crane was living out his final years and sat across from him and read a handwritten statement and signed his name below it as witness. Two old men in a room somewhere, both of them understanding that what they were doing needed to outlast both of them. Both of them putting their names on a piece of paper and trusting it to a sealed steel box and trusting that the box would eventually find its way to hands that could read it. Harold, who had spent 50 years teaching Earl that a tradesman finishes what he starts. Earl folded the oilcloth back over both documents. He set it aside. He reached into the box and took out the second thing. It was money, not in a bank envelope, not in any container that bore the name or mark of any financial institution. Banded in plain paper, the kind of bands a careful man makes himself from a strip of brown wrapping paper and a length of tape and stacked in 3 tight bricks. 5s and 10s and 20s, the denominations of a man who dealt in cash and kept what he saved, where he controlled it in places that had no connection to the affairs of anyone who might be watching and waiting. Earl did not count it. He had been around enough of other men's hard savings to know from the size and density of the 3 bricks that he was looking at a serious sum, the accumulated product of 51 years of a careful man putting aside what he could in a form and a location that no partner with a lawyer on retainer would ever find or touch. He set the money down gently. He wiped his hands on his work trousers out of pure habit, a lifelong gesture of care around other men's things, and reached into the box for the third item. It was an envelope. White standard size, slightly yellowed at the edges from the years sealed in the dark. On the front in pencil, not ink pencil, the tool of a man whose hands had lost confidence in their ability to write in ink without the letters wavering 2 lines of careful block print. To the man with patience enough to open this. Earl held the envelope, turned it over. The back was sealed, the flap pressed firmly down in the manner of someone who intended it to stay closed until the right time. He opened it with his pocket knife, carefully along the top edge, not tearing the envelope, but opening it the way you open something you respect. He unfolded the single page inside. He put his reading glasses on. He brought the page under the work light. He read. Gus Crane's letter was written in the same enlarged, deliberate print as the witness statement, each letter formed with the conscious attention of a man compensating for what his hands could no longer do automatically. It was writing that had taken time and cost something, writing that had been fully thought through before the first letter was set down, because a man working at that pace and with that level of difficulty does not write carelessly. He writes only what he means to write. The letter said in its essential substance the following: If you are reading this, then you did what no one in a hurry ever could have done. That tells me I can trust you. A man who will spend a whole night on a sealed box is a man who finishes what he starts. My name is August Crane. I have run a machine shop on Mill Road in Millhaven for 51 years. I built it and I ran it honestly, and I intend for the truth about it to survive the man who wants to take it. His name is Harwick Pratt. We entered a fair and equal partnership in 1962, documented in the agreement that is also in this box. Harwick walked away from the trade years ago and built his salvage business, while I ran the shop alone. That was our arrangement, and I was content with it. In recent years, as my health has failed, and my hands have become unreliable, I have watched Harwick watching me. I know what a waiting man looks like. I have known it for a long time, and Harwick Pratt has been wearing that face for several years now. He has a document. I believe he had it prepared sometime around 1979, when my handwriting had deteriorated enough to be imitated convincingly by someone patient enough to study it. The document claims I signed a new agreement that year, transferring my full interest in Crane Machine Works to him entirely. Not 50%. Everything. The building, the equipment, the accounts. Everything I built and maintained for 51 years. My daughter, Rowena, will not be able to fight this without proof. She is a capable and determined woman, with her mother's stubbornness and my hands. But she has no money for lawyers, and the lawyers in Millhaven have sat at Harwick Pratt's dinner table for 30 years. I understand what that means in practical terms, so I chose steel. I chose it because Harwick Pratt cannot lay a bead, and has never in his life had a reason to learn, and because a man who cannot read a weld will never think to look inside something he cannot simply pry open. I chose it because somewhere in this county there is someone with the knowledge to read what I have sealed here, and the honesty to do what needs to be done with it. I am trusting that you are that person, because you are the one who opened this. Find my daughter, Rowena Crane Aldis. She lives in Caldwell Township, 2 counties east. Give her what is in this box and let her use it. Let the truth about her father's life work reach her while she still has time to rebuild what she has lost. Steel does not lie. I have trusted that for 51 years. I am trusting it one more time. August R. Crane, November 1981. Earl read the letter through once without stopping. Then he folded it along its original creases and set it with the other documents and the money on the bench in front of him. He sat without moving for a long time. The clock on the wall above the bench read nearly midnight. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside, the front had arrived, and he could hear the wind working at the north wall of the shop with the low persistence of weather that has made up its mind about something. The concrete radiated cold upward through his boots. Earl Bowen thought about what he was holding and about what it asked of him and about whether he was the right man for it to be asking. He was 72 years old. He did not know Rowena Crane Aldis. He had perhaps seen her 3 times in 40 years in the peripheral way that men who keep to their work see the families of other men who keep to theirs. She was a woman in her early 50s, 2 counties east, living circumstances he could only guess at from what the letter implied, which was not good. He was not a lawyer, not an investigator, not a man with connections to the county courthouse or any particular standing in matters of property law. He was a welder and machinist in a town that had mostly stopped calling him, sitting alone in his shop at midnight with a dead man's evidence on his bench, and no obvious role in any of this beyond the $60 he had spent on a rusted box. Cledge Pratt had a salvage operation that ran across 3 counties and a father with 30 years of relationship with the men who made decisions in this part of Ohio. He had lawyers. He had established presence. He had the specific social authority that comes in a town like Millhaven from being the kind of loud, confident man that other people have learned to find it easier to agree with than to oppose. Earl sat with all of that for a long while. Then he stood up and walked to the utility sink at the back of the shop. He turned on the cold water and held both hands under it, letting it run over the knuckles and into the creases that 50 years of metalwork had made permanent. These were the hands Gus Crane had trusted, or had trusted the hands of whoever opened the box, which amounted to the same thing. These were hands that had run beads and read beads and known the difference between what a seal that was carefully made and a seal that was carelessly made felt like under the thumb. These were the hands the job had found. He turned off the water. He dried his hands on the shop towel. He went back to the bench. He wrapped the documents and the money and the letter back in the oilcloth with the same careful folds that had originally held them, and he set the package in the clean corner of the shelf above his bench where he kept things that mattered. Then he turned off the work light and left the fluorescent on low the way he always did and went inside to sleep. In the morning he would find out where Rowena Crane Aldis was living. But the morning brought something else first. Cledge Pratt's flatbed truck was parked at the end of Earl's driveway when Earl came out to open the shop at 6. Not in the driveway at the end of it on the road, shoulder-positioned where it was visible from both the house and the shop door, where a man coming out to begin his day would see it immediately and understand that its being there was not accidental. Cledge was in the cab. He had a travel cup of coffee. He waited until Earl had unlocked the shop and turned on the lights and been inside for a few minutes. Then the truck door opened and Cledge came across the frost-hardened grass and through the shop door without knocking, because Cledge Pratt was not a man who knocked at other people's shop doors. He was not smiling. The ease of the auction lot was gone. In its place was something more deliberate, the manner of a man who has spent several days thinking and has arrived at a position and intends to hold it. He came into the shop and looked around it in a way that was different from taking inventory, assessing the trained eye of a man who has spent his career calculating the value of things. "Morning, Earl," he said. "Morning," Earl said. He went to his bench and picked up the file he had set down 2 nights before. He did not sit down. Cledge walked a few steps in and stopped with his hands loose at his sides. "I heard you got the box open." "I did," Earl said. "Word gets around," Cledge said. He offered a version of his easy smile smaller than the auction lot version and without the invitation for others to join in. "Millhaven's a small town." He paused. "What was in it?" Earl looked up at him briefly, then back at the piece in his hands. "An old rusted box," he said. "Not much worth mentioning." Cledge was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bench. He looked at the shelf above the bench. His eyes stopped at the oilcloth package for exactly 1 second and moved on with the practiced casualness of a man who has decided not to let himself be seen looking at something. "Here is the thing, Earl," he said, and his voice shifted, not threatening, not yet, but moving in that direction, the way the barometric pressure moves ahead of weather, a change in quality that a careful observer can feel before the rain arrives. "My father put real money into that shop in 1962. He built a partnership with Gus Crane that was fair on both sides. He has documentation for how that arrangement stood at the time of Gus's death. Lawyers have reviewed it. It is all in proper order." Earl said nothing. "What I am saying," Cledge continued, "is that if someone were to attempt to use items from that estate, items obtained at auction, the status of which is not entirely clear under current estate law, to complicate a matter that has already been legally settled, that would create problems. Not just for the Pratt family, for the person holding those items." He paused, giving the pause its full weight. "There are questions, Earl, about what it constitutes when a man cuts open a piece of sealed estate property and removes its contents before the estate is fully closed. There are people who could raise those questions formally, if they had reason to." The shop was quiet. Earl set the file down on the bench. He turned and looked at Cledge Pratt directly and without any particular expression, and he held that look for a moment. He had received threats before in various forms and from various directions over 72 years of living. This one had been delivered in the language of legal abstraction, which was how men with lawyers delivered threats when they wanted to apply pressure without creating a record of the pressure. Earl understood the language. He also understood that he had paid $60 at a legitimate public auction with a receipt in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket for property offered to any bidder at any price, and that he had taken it home and opened it with his own equipment on his own premises, and that what he had found inside it was information, not property, and information left to him in a letter addressed to whoever had the patience to open the box. He looked at Cledge for a moment longer, then he picked up the file. "Then sue me, Cledge," he said, his voice level and without heat. "I'll be right here." The shop held its silence. The wind pushed at the north wall. Cledge Pratt stood in the center of the shop floor for a long moment, his eyes going once more to the oilcloth package on the shelf with the kind of deliberate non-focus that is itself a form of focus. Then he walked to the door and went out without another word. The door closed. The flatbed engine started. The truck pulled out onto the road and moved away. Earl stood at his bench. His hands on the file were carrying a fine additional tension, the kind that comes from standing ground against something that knows it is large and wanted you to know it too. He kept working. The tension moved through the file and into the steel and dissipated there the way tension does when you give it somewhere productive to go. He worked for 2 hours, finished the piece he had been working on, cleaned and stored the file, and then drove to Fergus Cable's shop on the east side of town. Fergus was under a mower on his creeper. He rolled out and looked up at Earl's face and read whatever was there, not much but enough. "You know where Rowena Crane ended up?" Earl said. Fergus sat up, wiped his hands, said he thought Morrow, County Caldwell Township, but he didn't have an address. He knew she had been working as a bookkeeper or something in that line. He had heard it from the Route 9 parts supplier who had it from someone else. "You going to tell me what was in the box?" Fergus said. "No," Earl said. Fergus looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded in the way of an old friend who understands that a thing is not his business and chooses to respect that without making an issue of it. He told Earl what he knew about Morrow County and the roads. Earl drove to Caldwell Township the following morning. He found Rowena Crane Aldous by stopping at the post office and explaining at the counter that he had something belonging to her father's estate and needed to deliver it to her personally. The woman at the counter looked at him with the assessing attention of someone deciding whether a stranger requesting another person's address represents a concern, and apparently concluded that a 72-year-old man with work-worn hands and a canvas jacket and a straightforward explanation was not. She wrote the address on a piece of paper and passed it across. The house was a small rental on a side street 2 blocks from the water tower, maintained within the limits of what a renter can do with a landlord's property. The porch was swept clean. 2 geraniums in clay pots sat on the porch rail past their season, now browning at the stem tips, but positioned far enough under the overhang to be sheltered from the worst of the wind. The gesture of someone who intends to see things through to their end rather than abandoning them when the outlook is no longer favorable. Earl parked on the street. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine off the oilcloth package on the seat beside him. There was nothing particular to rehearse. He was not there to make a speech or construct an argument. He was there to return something to the person it belonged to, which was a simple and straightforward thing that did not require preparation. He got out. He picked up the package. He went up the porch steps and knocked. Rowena Crane Aldous came to the door after a short wait. A woman in her early 50s, lean and upright in the manner of someone who has been carrying difficulty for some time, without allowing it to change the way she stands. She had her father's eyes, the same careful quality of attention, the same measured way of looking at a new thing before deciding what to make of it. She was wearing clothes that showed work practical and worn at the knees, and her hands on the doorframe were the hands of a woman who had used them seriously and often. Earl took his cap off. "My name is Earl Bowen," he said. "I'm a welder and machinist out of Millhaven. I bought a sealed box at the Crane Estate auction on the 6th of October. He held out the oilcloth package. "This was inside it. Your father sealed it himself. He wanted you to have what is in it." Rowena looked at him, then at the package, then at his face again, with those careful eyes reading him the way her father had read things fully before deciding. Then she took the package. "Come in," she said. Earl shook his head. He stepped back from the door. He put his cap on. "Take your time with it," he said. "If you need to reach me, Fergus Cable in Millhaven has my number." He was at the bottom of the porch steps when she spoke. "Mr. Bowen." He stopped. "How did you know there was something in it?" she said. "There were other people at that auction." She paused. No one else would have known. Earl looked back at her. She was holding the oilcloth package against her chest with both hands, with the specific careful grip of someone holding something they have not yet permitted themselves to fully believe is real. "Your father ran a clean weld," Earl said. "Steady and deliberate. He used both hands at the end, you can feel where. A dying man's last careful work. I have been reading welds for 57 years. He looked at her for a moment without looking away. He knew someone would be able to read it. He was right. He walked to his truck and drove back to Millhaven. Behind him on the porch of the small rental house, Rowena Crane Aldous stood with her father's sealed evidence held against her chest and watched the old pickup turn at the end of the street and disappear around the corner. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside and sat at her kitchen table and unfolded the oilcloth. She read the 1962 partnership agreement first, then the witness statement slowly, every word, and when she reached Harold Finch's signature beneath her father's, she stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Harold Finch, a name her father had spoken with the particular quiet respect he reserved for the people whose quality he had recognized without needing to describe it. She read the letter last. She read it at the pace her father had written it, giving each sentence its full weight. When she reached the line about choosing steel, about trusting steel more than any courthouse in the county, she set the page down and looked out the kitchen window at the October afternoon going gray at its edges. And she thought about her father sitting somewhere in the latter years of his life, his hands unsteady, watching Harwick Pratt with the patient eyes of a man who knows what watching looks like because he has been watched, and deciding what he could still do. He had not panicked, he had not raged. He had thought it through and decided what was still within his reach, and he had reached for it calmly, methodically, in the same way he had always done things. He had gotten Harold Finch to sit with him and sign a witness statement. He had documented 3 years of work orders, proving independent operation. He had gathered 51 years of saved cash from wherever he had kept it hidden from the wrong hands. He had written a letter and sealed everything in a steel box and run the last clean weld he had left in him to keep it safe until the right person found it. He had done all of this knowing he might not live to see it matter, knowing that Rowena might not find it for years, knowing that whoever found it might not understand what they were holding, knowing that the whole careful plan depended on a chain of contingencies too long to be fully controlled, and choosing to trust that chain anyway because it was the best he could do, and the best he could do was worth doing completely. She looked at the money then. She sat for a long time looking at the 3 paper-banded bricks. She thought about what 51 years of small, careful savings outside any institution Harwick Pratt might touch had accumulated to, and what that sum meant for what came next. She called a lawyer in Columbus the following morning. Rowena Crane Aldous called a lawyer in Columbus the morning after Earl Bowen drove away. His name was Aldous Kepner, and he had been recommended by a colleague at the bookkeeping firm where Rowena worked, a woman whose brother had used him in a boundary dispute, and found him precise and unsentimental in the specific way that useful lawyers are focused entirely on what documents say rather than what anyone wishes they said. Rowena told him over the phone what she had. He asked several questions in a quick, efficient manner, then asked her to come to Columbus and bring everything. She drove to Columbus 2 days later with the oilcloth package on the passenger seat. Kepner was a compact man in his late 40s with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and a desk organized with the dense efficiency of someone who processes a large volume of paper and never misplaces any of it. He read the documents Rowena gave him without speaking. He read the 1962 partnership agreement first, then the witness statement, then the letter. He read each one twice. Then he arranged them in a precise row on the desk and looked at them together, his glasses down on his nose, his hands flat on the desk's surface. Then he asked Rowena to describe the document Harwick Pratt had presented in February in as much detail as she could recall the paper, the type, the positioning of the text, the signature, the date. She described it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said a signature, produced by a man whose hands shook the way your father's did in his later years, is difficult to authenticate against a careful forgery. The tremor pattern can be studied and imitated, but a prior witnessed statement signed by 2 parties, one of whom had no financial interest and no conceivable motive to lie, that is a different matter. Particularly when the statement was made 2 years before the alleged agreement and specifically anticipates the kind of forgery that occurred. He picked up Harold Finch's signature on the witness statement. "This man," he said. "What was his relationship to your father?" "A colleague," Rowena said. "A fellow tradesman. They had known each other for 40 years. He was the man who taught the welder who found the box." Kepner looked at the signature. "Can it be independently verified?" Rowena slid a photograph across the desk. A photograph Earl Bowen had taken with the small camera he kept in his glove box for documenting repair jobs of a bank account card at the Millhaven branch of the County Savings Institution opened by Harold Finch in 1980 and bearing his signature in his own hand. Earl had asked at the bank counter and had been allowed to photograph the card on the basis of his explanation of why he needed it, which had apparently been persuasive enough. Kepner held the photograph beside the witness statement for a long time. He held both at the same angle under the same light and looked at them with the patient thoroughness of a man who has spent his career knowing that the difference between a signature that matches and a signature that merely resembles can be the entire substance of a case. Something settled in his expression. Not a dramatic change, he was not a demonstrative man, but a particular quality of confirmation, the look of a man whose working hypothesis has just been supported by the available evidence. "There is one more thing," Rowena said. She reached into the envelope she had brought and took out the last item from the oilcloth package, the piece Earl had nearly missed on the first night, tucked beneath the folded letter in a plain sleeve. She slid it across the desk. It was a handwritten list, 14 entries in Gus Crane's deliberate enlarged print. Each entry had a date, a description of work completed, a dollar amount, and a customer's name. The dates ran from March of 1979 through November of 1983. At the top, in slightly larger letters, Gus had written, "Orders completed as sole proprietor, Crane Machine Works, subsequent to the date of the alleged agreement." Each entry signed, August R. Crane, sole proprietor. No co-signature, no mention of Harwick Pratt, no indication that any other party held ownership or authority over the operation of the business. 14 jobs. Nearly 5 years of independent documented operation by a man who had supposedly transferred his entire ownership of that business in 1979 and yet had continued in the sole proprietor capacity, signing contracts, collecting payment, recording transactions for 5 years after that alleged transfer. Kepner read the list. He read it twice. He placed it in the row with the other documents and looked at all of them together. Then he said, "I will need to see the document Harwick Pratt presented. His attorney will be required to produce it. When they do, and when I place it alongside what you have given me today, I believe we will find that the conversation with the Pratt family is a short one." Rowena drove back to Caldwell Township in the afternoon, through the flat Ohio countryside with the fields browning and the sky holding its hard autumn blue. And she thought about her father, about what it had cost him at the end of a long life and a failing body to do what he had done. About the deliberateness of it, the patience of it, the refusal to give in to the panic that a man facing Harwick Pratt's maneuvering might reasonably have felt. He had not panicked. He had assessed the situation with the clear eye of a machinist, looking at a difficult job, identified what he could do and what he could not do, and done the things he could do as thoroughly and precisely as his remaining capacity allowed. He had prepared for contingencies. He had documented what needed documenting. He had trusted that the truth properly preserved and properly placed would find its way to someone who could carry it the rest of the distance. He had been right. The only element of his plan he could not have controlled was who would open the box, and he had addressed that by making the box openable only by someone who knew what a deliberate weld felt like under the thumb. He had trusted steel, and he had trusted the kind of man who spends 50 years learning to read it. The meeting that Kepner arranged with Harwick Pratt's attorney took place in the 3rd week of November in a conference room at the county courthouse 2 counties over from Millhaven. It was not a trial or a formal hearing. It was a proceeding in which the competing documents would be examined by both parties, together with a mediator present, and the question of which agreement reflected the actual terms of the partnership would be addressed directly before either side committed to the expense and visibility of formal litigation. Harwick Pratt came with his attorney and his son. Harwick was 62 years old. He had been a large man in his working years and still carried the frame of it, though the years had softened and settled what had once been imposing. He moved with the careful economy of a man whose body requires more attention than it used to, and he came into the conference room without the ease of manner that had probably characterized him for most of his life. He sat at the table and put his hands on the surface in front of him and looked at the documents as Kepner arranged them. His attorney was younger, competent, dressed for the occasion in a way that communicated confidence without arrogance. He carried himself with the professional assurance of a man who has reviewed his client's position and believes it is defensible. Cledge. Pratt sat to his father's right. Company polo. Company cap. Forearms on the table, jaw set with the expression of a man who has already decided the proceedings are a formality and is waiting for them to be finished, so everyone can get back to how things were. Kepner placed the documents on the table in order. He was not a theatrical man and did not arrange things for effect. He arranged them in the sequence they would need to be addressed. The 1962 partnership agreement. The witness statement from 1981. The photograph of Harold Finch's bank signature card. The list of 14 post-1979 orders signed by Gus Crane as sole proprietor. Harwick Pratt's attorney asked to examine each document. He was given the time to do so. He looked at the 1962 agreement carefully. He spent longer with the witnessed statement. He held the bank's signature card photograph beside Harold Finch's signature on the statement and looked at both at the same angle and the same distance for a while without speaking. When he got to the list of 14 orders, he set it down and was quiet. Harwick had been watching the attorney's face. He was reading it the way a man reads a barometer for what the needle is doing, for what the reading means about what is coming. What the attorney's face said was not favorable. Kepner let the silence occupy the room. He was good at this. Then Harwick Pratt said in a voice that was low and stripped of the performance of confidence Harold has been gone since '83. Kepner said he signed the witness statement in March of 1981. His signature on that document has been compared by independent review to his documented signature on file at a financial institution he used from 1980 until his death. The comparison is unambiguous. Harwick looked at the witness statement. He looked at it for a long time in the specific way of a man searching for a thread that will unravel the thing in front of him and not finding it. The room was quiet. Harwick Pratt placed both hands flat on the table. Not a gesture of authority. A gesture of a man making contact with a solid surface because he needs something solid to hold on to while he processes what he is looking at. Then he looked at the list of 14 orders. He looked at it line by line from the first entry in March of 1979 to the last entry in November of 1983. He read each customer name, each description of work, each dollar amount. He read the designation at the top, sole proprietor. 5 years. Gus Crane had continued to run Crane Machine Works in the sole proprietor capacity for 5 years after the date on which the document Harwick had presented claimed the business had passed entirely to him. 5 years of signed contracts and collected payments and recorded transactions with Gus Crane's name at the bottom and no other name beside it. Harwick said very quietly, not to anyone in particular, he just kept running it. It was not a question, it was a man looking at what a person he had underestimated had done, and understanding for the first time the full scope of what that person had prepared. He just kept running it. 5 years. Cledge Pratt, beside his father, had stopped looking at anyone. He was looking at the table surface in front of him with the fixed attention of a man who has removed himself from the proceedings in the only way still available to him. Harwick Pratt's attorney leaned toward his client and spoke quietly for a moment. Harwick listened. He did not respond. His hands remained flat on the table. Whatever the attorney was offering in the way of options or arguments, Harwick was not reaching for them. The discussion that followed was brief. Harwick Pratt's attorney asked for 3 days to consult with his client. Kepner agreed to 2. At the end of those 2 days, the attorney called and informed Kepner that his client wished to resolve the matter without further proceedings and accepted the proposed terms without modification. Full restoration of Crane Machine Works and its associated accounts to the estate of Auguste Crane for the benefit of Rowena Crane Aldis as sole heir. All legal costs borne by the Pratt family. No admission of wrongdoing required, which was a concession Kepner had included because he understood that what Harwick Pratt needed to give up was the claim and what he was being permitted to preserve was the absence of a public record. In exchange for what amounted to everything, Harwick Pratt got to leave the room. The documents were filed. The accounts transferred the title to the building on Mill Road, and the equipment inside it restored to the name it had always rightfully carried in the quiet and procedural way that legal matters resolve when one side has the truth fully documented and the other side knows the cost of making that documentation public. There was no announcement. There was no public proceeding. There was paperwork and signatures and the efficient mechanism of the law doing what the law is occasionally able to do when it is properly supplied with evidence. Earl heard about it the way he heard about most things from Fergus Cable, who stopped by the shop on a December morning with the specific look of a man who has been waiting to deliver something, Fergus told him. Earl listened without interrupting. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the timeline. Fergus answered them. Earl said that was good, and meant it, and went back to the equipment frame he was repairing. Fergus stood in the door for a moment. "You're not going to tell me what was in the box," he said. "No," Earl said. Fergus put his cap on and went home. 3 days later, Cledge Pratt's truck appeared at the end of Earl's driveway in the early morning. Not the flatbed this time, a plain work truck unmarked. Cledge came across the frozen grass and into the shop, and this time he knocked on the doorframe before entering. Earl was at the bench. Cledge came in and stopped just inside the door. He was wearing a plain canvas jacket, no company logo, no company cap. He looked like a man who had slept poorly for several weeks and had arrived at the far side of that period without a clear map of what came next. He looked around the shop. His eyes moved over the bench, the equipment, the tools on their racks. They stopped at Harold Finch's leather apron on the nail beside the door, the dark, stiff, work-worn apron with the small burn hole near the left pocket. He looked at it for a moment with no particular expression. Then he looked at Earl. "You could have left it alone," he said. His voice was not threatening and not conciliatory. It was the voice of a man who has been carrying a sentence for a long time and has finally decided that setting it down requires saying it out loud. Old box. Old man's business from 30 years ago. You could have taken your $60 as a loss and walked away. Earl set the file down. He turned and looked at Cledge directly. It was his name in that box, Earl said. And her name. A man uses the last clean weld he has left in him to seal something. There is a reason for it. You don't leave that alone. The shop was quiet. The December wind worked at the north wall. Cledge looked at the apron on the nail again, at the dark canvas and the stiff hem and the burn hole near the pocket, the working life of a man compressed into an object that had outlasted him. He looked back at Earl. He did not say anything else. He had come, Earl understood, with a single thing to say, and he had said it, and it had been answered, and the answer was the answer, and was not going to change. There was nothing further to negotiate, and nothing further to argue, and nothing further that either of them needed from the other. Cledge turned and walked out of the shop. Earl listened to his boots on the gravel and the sound of the truck door and the engine starting and the truck moving away down the county road until the sound was gone. He looked at Harold Finch's apron on the nail. Then he looked back at the equipment frame on his bench, at the crack propagation he had been mapping, at the work still waiting to be done. He picked up the file and went back to it. The name the Tin Man had been given at the October auction did not survive the winter in any meaningful form. Not because anyone held a ceremony of its retirement, not because the men who had stood along the fence and laughed along with Cledge Pratt formally reconsidered their behavior. In towns like Millhaven, reputations do not reverse themselves by announcement. They shift the way weather shifts gradually without anyone calling attention to the change, until one day the air simply feels different and has been feeling different for long enough that no one can remember exactly when it changed. What happened was quiet and practical. Men who had developed the habit of calling a contractor from Columbus when they had a welding problem began here and there to remember that there was a man on the edge of Millhaven who had been doing that work correctly for 50 years and who had recently demonstrated in a way that the county was now aware of, that he knew what he was looking at when he looked at something. A farm equipment frame that needed a repair no replacement part could replicate. A pump casing that had to be built up from what was there, rather than substituted. The small, persistent work of a community that had never stopped producing broken things and had briefly forgotten where to bring them. The phone in Earl's shop began to ring more consistently. Not dramatically, not all at once. One job at a time, arriving with the irregular but accumulating frequency of a current that has found a channel and is moving through it. Earl answered the phone and looked at the jobs and gave honest estimates and did the work right, which had always been the only way he knew to do it. Crane Machine Works reopened on a Monday morning in the second week of April, 1985. Rowena had spent the winter getting the shop back into order, not only legally, but physically and operationally. Harwick Pratt's period of control had lasted only a few months, but it had been enough to disrupt what Gus had built over 51 years. Equipment repositioned without understanding why it had been placed where it was. The organizational logic of the tool storage disturbed. The filing system for job records, muddled documents interleaved with papers that had no business being there. Rowena put it back. She knew how it was supposed to be organized because she had grown up in it. The shop and the rooms above it had been continuous in her childhood, not two separate spaces, but one coherent world, the rhythms of the work inseparable from the rhythms of the life above it. She had learned to read a micrometer before she could drive a car, had understood from early childhood that the machines and the tools and the systems for keeping them in order were not arbitrary arrangements, but the accumulated practical wisdom of a man who had thought carefully about how to make difficult work possible and had organized his environment accordingly. She put the tools back on their racks in the order of size her father had used. She re-established the filing system the way she remembered it. She restored the spatial arrangement of the machines relative to each other and to the windows and the power drops according to the logic that had always governed them and that she had understood since she was old enough to think about it. She was a machinist. She had learned from Gus Crane, who had learned from his own father, which meant that the knowledge running in her hands had been transmitted by proximity and practice across 3 generations. She had not attended any institution that granted credentials in the trade. She had done something more direct. She had grown up inside the work, and the work had gotten into her the way Harold Finch's way of working had gotten into Earl Bowen gradually through long exposure to someone who did it right, until right became the only way that felt natural. On the morning Crane Machine Works reopened, several people from Millhaven drove out on Mill Road on various pretexts. A part to have machined, an estimate on a job, a visit that did not explain itself very clearly. They came in and stood for a moment just inside the door and looked at the shop, at the order of it, the tools properly stored, the machines correctly, placed the light through the clean windows falling on a swept concrete floor. And they understood without being told that this was not a shop that had been cleaned up for reopening. This was a shop that had been restored to itself. In the far corner, on a low shelf beside the window behind a pane of glass that Rowena had fitted herself from a piece she had found in the storage room, sat the steel box. Its lid had been set back in place, not re-welded, just resting slightly offset from true, the cut edge showing where Earl's torch had opened it cleanly. The bead of Gus Crane's final weld running around the outside of the cut in its steady and slightly imperfect ring. The ring of a man who had refused to let shaking hands stop him from doing the last necessary thing. Beside the box, propped against the back wall of the shelf, was a small card in a plain frame. It said, August R. Crane. Crane Machine Works. 1933, 1984. People who came into the shop stopped at the glass. They looked at the box with the open lid and the cut seam and the name on the card. Some of them asked Rowena what it was. She told them briefly and without elaboration in the direct manner she had gotten from her father. They listened. Then they went about their business. The box stayed in its corner behind its pane of glass in the light from the window through the spring and into the summer. It was still there on an afternoon in late August of 1985 when Earl Bowen drove out on Mill Road with no particular errand and no particular plan, and parked his half-ton on the road shoulder in the same place he had parked it on the morning of the Crane Estate auction 10.5 months earlier. He sat in the cab with the engine off for a moment. He looked at the building on Mill Road. He looked at the sign above the door, Crane Machine Works, painted in the original style and the original colors, because some things are worth the effort of getting exactly right. He got out. He did not go to the shop door. He walked across the gravel and the grass to the far corner of the building to the window where the shelf was, where the glass pane was, where the box sat in the light that came through from inside. He stood at the window. The afternoon light came through the main windows of the shop at the low angle of late August in Ohio. The particular warm tone that carries the end of summer in it. The light that makes everything it touches look as if it has been there for a long time and intends to stay. In that light on its shelf, the box sat with its cut lid slightly askew, and the bead of Gus Crane's last weld circling its seam in the steady, slightly hesitant ring of a man who had used both hands and every year of his experience, and all the patience and stubborn precision he had left to seal something that mattered inside something that would last. Earl put his right hand flat against the window glass. He held it there. The glass was warm from the afternoon sun. Through it, just inside the box, sat where Rowena had placed it. Earl looked at the surface of the lid at the spot he had found at the auction where the rust crust had thinned and the crown of the bead had shown through most clearly, where a dying man's last careful weld had spoken to him in the language both of them had spent their lives learning. Inside the shop, Rowena was at the lathe. Her back was to the window. A part turned slowly and chuck her hands at the controls in the way of someone for whom the machine is an extension of thought rather than a separate instrument to be managed. The same hands her father had working the same trade her father had worked in the shop her father had built and that a sealed steel box had given back to her. She turned her head. She had heard something or sensed something or simply looked at the right moment. She looked at Earl through the glass. She looked at his hand, flat against the window in the place where the light fell on the box on its shelf. Her expression was not surprise. It was not sentimentality. It was the expression of someone who had been expecting something without knowing exactly what form it would take and had just seen it take its form. She nodded. Once. Quietly. Earl nodded back. He took his hand off the glass. He looked at the box one more time, at the open lid and the cut seam and Gus Crane's name on the card in the plain frame, and he stood there for a moment with the late August light warm on his face, and the sound of the lathe running inside the building, the sound of the work continuing, which is the sound a shop makes when it is alive. Then he put his cap on and walked back to his truck. He drove home. He opened the shop and went back to the job on his bench. The fluorescent light hummed above him in its single steady note unchanged. The leather apron hung on its nail beside the door. The shop smelled of oil and metal and time the way it had always smelled, and the work was there waiting for him. The way work always is when a man has built his life around doing it right. A man does not seal a box against rust. Rust is patient, but it is not intelligent. It does not choose what it destroys. It cannot distinguish between a thing that matters and a thing that does not. It works on everything equally and without intention. You do not need a weld to keep rust out. You seal a box against people, against the wrong hands and the wrong intentions and the men who stand along the fence, calculating the weight of things they will never understand. Gus Crane ran his last bead on a November night in 1981, with both hands braced and his elbows in, and all the patience and precision that 51 years of honest work had accumulated in him, and he sealed inside that box the truth about his life's work and his daughter's inheritance, and the record of what he had actually built and what he had actually agreed to. He trusted Steele because Steele had never lied to him. He trusted that the right hands would eventually find the box and know what it was saying. Harold Finch had trusted it too. Had driven out to wherever Gus was living in his last years and signed his name beneath a dying man's statement, because that was what a tradesman did when asked to witness something that needed to be witnessed. And because Harold Finch was, among other things, a man who understood that the truth sometimes needs someone to stand next to it and say, "I was here. I saw this. This is real." Earl Bowen had paid $60 and spent 4 evenings and used the last of his cutting gas and trusted what 57 years of reading steel had told his thumb at a rusted box on a cold October morning when the loud man in the red polo shirt was doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was to stand at the fence and laugh. The truth had ridden out 3 years in sealed steel and come back to set a wronged woman on her feet. It had taken $60 and one patient old welder to carry it the last part of the way home. The Tin Man had bought himself a tin box. As it turned out, he was right to. If you had been at that auction on that October morning, if you had walked the rows and come to the back of the lot and found a rusted box sitting apart from everything else with a $5 tag, and nobody near it, would you have crouched down? Would you have taken your glove off and run your thumb along the seam, or would you have laughed with the loud man in the red shirt and let the truth rust shut for another generation?